everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us with SilverCloud's latest instalment of our Hello Helpdesk webinar series. Today's topic is Dayforce snag lists, streamlining HR, payroll, and operations. My name's Will. I'm the account executive here at SilverCloud. So over the last 2.5 years, I've worked closely with our Dayforce practice, helping clients who are either implementing, optimizing, or enhancing their Dayforce platforms. And I'm joined by the amazing Vicky.
Hello Helpdesk. My name is Vicky. I am one of the Dayforce implementation specialists here at SilverCloud. I've worked with a number of different clients over the past 2.5 years here. Actually, prior to joining SilverCloud, I was on the client side in terms of being part of HR teams that were implementing Dayforce. So whether that was Dayforce talent modules or core and WFM. Most recently, the project before I joined SilverCloud was to address WFM configuration issues at a company across 9 European countries. So they had gone live, things didn't work out quite the way they expected, and so I was there supporting them in terms of their configuration adjustments and redoing some of that initial configuration.
Thanks, Vicky. So today is part 1 of 2, and the idea is that Vicky and myself and liaising with the rest of our Dayforce team over the last 5 years, SilverCloud working with Dayforce clients, we put our heads together and thought, what were the top 10 snag list items that commonly occur in the projects that we're working on, and spinning that up into a series where we talk you through those and give you some rationale and some workarounds using Dayforce to its full potential. So today is part 1 through 5, and then we'll have a follow-up session 6 through 10. We can keep it interactive, so you'll see on your screen there is a Q&A button. If you have any questions as we go along, please fire those in, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go. So the topics we'll be covering cover the wide breadth of functionality across the Dayforce platform. So whether you're currently implementing, maybe you've recently gone live, or you're looking to expand Dayforce, whether it's to other locations or functionality. It could even be that you're reviewing the HRIS market currently and you just want to learn a bit more about Dayforce. But either way, I hope there's something that will be worthwhile for you today. So without further ado, we'll kick off with our first point. What we're going to discuss here is entitlement and holiday balances. So Dayforce has a depth of functionality here to handle complex entitlement and annual leave balances requirements that organizations have, but we have seen that these aren't always configured correctly in the system. So, Vicky, I think a good starting point would be looking at common reasons for these miscalculations.
Thanks. Well, this is one of the most common areas of optimization we've seen across different clients and in relation to things like entitlements and their holiday balances. So typically we've seen due to changes in statutory minimums, for example, having to award paid balances when initially during implementation they were unpaid, introduction of new leaves, for example, compassionate care leave, additional types of statutory leaves that need to now be tracked in the system and tied to a grant balance. And as well, we've encountered a number of organizations that now need to change their configuration as they're offering sometimes flexi time. So in other words, if an employee works extra hours throughout the week, they're then awarded an additional time off in lieu in the future. So these types of configuration adjustments are quite common from across our various projects. One thing we have seen in terms of common miscalculations is really looking at the annual leave balances. That's something that we see often time and time again, whether that the annual leave is not carrying over correctly into the next year, or potentially at the end of the month, if an employee has excess balances, how does the system handle that excess? Does it carry forward? Is it paid out in payroll? So there are a number of common reasons for miscalculations. It really does stem from your pay policies configuration and as well potentially your entitlements policies configuration. So let's take an example of an annual leave carryover at the end of the calendar year from December into January. There are a lot of improvements that could be made to the balance carryover rules that would then cascade down to the entitlement policy itself. We could also consider optimizing your cascading pay codes so that when the employee requests for future time off, the correct balances deduct from the carryover days first before the regular new holidays awarded are deducted. So there's a number of areas that you could look at to improve the rules and the calculations, and that does stem from your WFM configuration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've touched upon it there, but I guess best practice in terms of automating the leave calculations effectively and in part then also ensuring you're reducing, I guess, manual intervention, which we see quite a lot with this part of the platform.
Yes, so there's a number of reasons for the miscalculation. We would recommend considering using a daily accrual grant as opposed to a monthly grant. The reason being that a lot of manual calculations are done during the leaver process, for example, or related to excess balances. So when employees are required to be paid out if they have unused leaves, or maybe they've accrued this time, but they haven't taken it yet, and there is a policy where this balance needs to be paid out. The best recommended configuration is to configure the grant on that daily occurrence. That way, the system automatically has a very accurate figure of the remaining balance that needs to be paid out, and that would then reduce further manual calculations needed by either your payroll team or the HR team trying to figure out what the actual remaining balance should be paid out to that leaving employee should be. So this will help further reduce manual input from either the payroll team or the HR team, and it's something that we highly recommend to look at if you're not currently accruing your balances daily.
And when you were working on the client side, aside from manual intervention, which of course we all know is time consuming, what were the other wider impacts you would see on businesses if they weren't configuring this correctly in the system?
Yeah, I think the main impact that I've noticed is for a lot of HR teams spending so much time reconciling manually these month or year-end balances. And this involves in the system having to manually increment one by one individual employee records for their balances tables. And it's a significant amount of time spent on that. Aside from that, let's take a look at it from the employee's perspective. Employees, if you don't have the accurate balances carried over, that's one of the first things that they raise during January or February when the balance is supposed to be reinitiated. There's typically some confusion, and employees raise queries to the payroll team or the HR team asking, I thought I had 3 days left over from last year, and how come Dayforce is only showing a day and a half? You know, what happened to my missed days? So it's not really pleasant from that employee experience and that perspective on having to then lose a bit of trust in terms of the system and what you're seeing. This also has a wider effect on the payroll and HR teams that might be focused on end of year BAU activities. So if you're managing year-end performance reviews or there's obligatory payroll reports, the influxes of these types of balance inquiries just add to the workload of the payroll and HR team members. So ensuring you get those calculations right and you're automating some of those calculations is critical during this time period.
Yeah, it's a good point. I always think pay and holiday entitlement are the two things that employees sort of hate being wrong the most, I guess. And I think we've all probably done it with other roles or jobs where you think your holiday is wrong when it's reset for the year, and then you are not having to go back to last year, but also the year before because maybe you carried some holiday over into the previous year. And I think it quickly becomes complicated doing it for one person, even assessing your own annual leave. But yeah, I think the knock-on impact it's going to have if that's a widespread issue in a business I think it's pretty clear. So great. So point 2 we're going to move on to is payroll discrepancies due to incorrect data. So I think data will be a recurring theme throughout this webinar, but data, of course, is a crucial part of any HRIS system, and it is a bit of a cliche, but if you put bad data in, you're going to get bad data out. So let's talk a little bit about how data discrepancies can be rectified using the Dayforce functionality, Vicky.
So when we think about payroll errors or payroll discrepancies, the root cause is really stemming from the core and WFM configuration. By the time those calculations and pay codes are ran through the pay run management area of Dayforce, it's kind of already a bit too late. So all this data that is flowing through from your core policies assigned to the employment settings, all this data that's captured through your timesheets, including these potential premiums or additional configuration. If this is already incorrect, it's all being passed through on the payroll side. And I do want to make a distinction here that we understand some organizations aren't using the native Dayforce payroll features, so they're not running payroll through Dayforce. But this also still has an impact on if you're providing additional reports for your outside external payroll providers. They need accurate summaries and calculations in order to run payroll correctly. So what we've seen is that the root cause of a number of payroll issues is related to WFM configuration. So we would consider relooking at some of those pay policies that you've configured on the WFM side, and even look at some of those details tied in with your entitlements and balances. So the pay codes that you create in your system itself, they're reused multiple times across both entitlements, balances, and pay policies on the WFM end. These are all linked together in a single platform. So it's really identifying the root cause of the issue in core and WFM before it gets to the payroll side.
I think it's an interesting point because often when we speak to clients that have had payroll discrepancies, they will say there's an issue with our payroll, but actually what you're highlighting there is it's almost, I guess, too late. If it's got to payroll and there's been a payroll data issue, actually you need to have a look at that golden thread almost of where that issue's originated in the platform. So I think that's a really good bit of advice. And I don't think that's necessarily common knowledge unless you have gone through the process of rectifying something like this. You've touched upon it there, but are there any other data accuracy or validation techniques that you would recommend for people with data discrepancies here?
Yeah, the standard process that we've seen time and time again is having payroll or HR admins validating some of the data, whether it's through the during the pay period, or they maybe have a checklist of items that they're identifying. For example, HR might be aware of any new joiners that have started, making sure that this information is passed to payroll. Same thing with leavers that are coming up. But we do want to point out that Dayforce has launched a new feature called Dayforce Copilot. It's really their version of AI, which is embedded into the system, which actually can help a lot of organizations with data accuracy and validation. So one of the specific functionalities, and it's pretty remarkable, through Dayforce Copilot, is that it allows a user to prompt the system to look for significant payroll variances between last month and this month, and compare the two. So you have a quick recap of maybe a 5 or 10 or maybe 20% variance between payroll between the 2 months, and that can help some of the payroll admins identify and look into why this large variance is occurring. It is a pretty rather impressive feature offered by Dayforce Copilot. For those that are interested in hearing more about Dayforce Copilot and how it can automate repetitive and manual tasks, there might be a possible future Hello Helpdesk session on this, so look out for this update in the future.
Yeah, I know when we was talking this webinar through yesterday, we said we'd probably do a whole separate session on Copilot, and yeah, it's pretty impressive functionality. I'm sure everyone needs another AI webinar. That'll be the first one anyone's seen, I'm sure. But yeah, no, it is very impressive in the Dayforce platform. And on that point, on this subject, compliance risks. What are some of the compliance risks, and how best to address those with data discrepancies for your payroll?
Yeah, so as we know, payroll and employee personal identifiable information is really one of the most sensitive data sets in your system. There's a number of different ways that you could restrict access, look at removing different roles that shouldn't see different areas of the employee record, or potentially restrict access to payroll. Our recommendation is to never stop due diligence of this to ensure that your data protection of these sensitive areas are compliant. We would recommend a structured governance approach with an established frequency to review things like your Dayforce security roles. Initially during implementation, usually the roles are thoroughly tested. Great, you get to deploying everything in production, but sometimes some organizations forget to revisit those. Just because they were initially established at the beginning of the project doesn't mean that there are introductions and changes that needs to be made to ensure that the correct people are accessing the right areas of the platform. You really want to ensure that users have the right access to the Dayforce features and look at those authorizations as well, whether or not these users should have the right view or edit capabilities for their role. Some other areas, oh, sorry, well, and some other areas I would
Yeah,
recommend as well. To just look at would be once you've reviewed the Dayforce security roles, look at your document types security. So document management, again, is something that usually is addressed maybe toward the beginning stages of your phase 1 implementation. And it's sometimes forgotten in the background, but we would recommend ensuring that all the documents you're storing in the system, that you're reviewing those security roles. As well for employee properties, this is also something that you can restrict by role. So make sure you're double checking that any data that you're capturing, any fields in employee properties are restricted.
yeah, that's really good points there. I think one thing I picked up on was there's often robust data policies during implementation and cleansing and ensuring everything's correctly set up. But organizations, of course, change and develop and grow post live. So I think one thing I picked up on there is keeping those robust processes and reviews in place. I said I wasn't going to say too many cliches today, but you never stop implementing is, I think, another one that we would probably both agree with and throw out there. So yeah, it's working at this to continue. You're still getting the most out of it and being as accurate as possible, not just having that emphasis during implementation of the system. Last question for you, Vicky, on this point. What would you consider as best practice for organizations that may manually be importing payroll data into their Dayforce platform?
Yeah, so there is a very detailed manual HR import process for those organizations that are making batch changes to their payroll data. It could be various functionalities like importing unpaid leaves or potentially sick leaves or major changes to your employee records that would impact payroll. Another example would be importing bonus cycles if you're paying out bonus cycles periodically. This would be imported directly into the system if you're not utilizing Dayforce compensation. So some of the best practices we've seen when it comes to the manual import of this data is to also follow your security and governance structure, ensuring that whatever you're importing into the system is fully protected through either the SFTP process or some other alternative method, because you want to make sure that all this information is captured correctly, and the people who actually see this in the system side of things should have access to this information. So make sure you're following that structured governance approach to anything related to sensitive payroll information being imported.
Yeah, I think there's some common themes there. Thank you, Vicky. So moving on now to our third point for today, we're going to have a look at manual adjustments to employee working hours and shift patterns. So I know this is a particular area of expertise for you, Vicky, but so a bit of background, I think, with this one. Dayforce, of course, has a breadth of functionality in terms of complex shift pattern and requirements. Therefore, it does tend to attract large, complex organizations. There's, of course, a strong presence in retail, hospitality, logistics, manufacturing, but again, some best practice doesn't always seep through, and we can see some manual adjustments happening here. So I'm going to hand over to you, Vicky, to talk about Dayforce's full potential and really how to avoid manual adjustments in this part of the platform.
Yeah, so typically what we've seen is that for those organizations where their workforce is typically hourly or potentially fluctuating from a week by week basis, hospitality, for example, hospitals itself, in health and medical industries, it's very common that the employees would have fluctuating schedules, and therefore requires a lot of attention from either a scheduler or a manager to then manipulate the schedule before it's being published to the employees. So from an example that we've seen where this has regularly occurred is that during initial implementation, potentially the focus was maybe on the full-time workforce, might be on a salaried type of pay. But then when it comes to changing business requirements, you may start hiring a lot of part-timers that would have fluctuating hours, whether that's weekly hours or even just hours during the day. There's a number of organizations where we've worked with where we've had to look at reconfiguring some of their initial working hours and their shift patterns in order to ensure that the pay policies and the WFM components are working together correctly. So in that type of example where you are looking at significant changes to the way you're scheduling your employees or some of your work patterns, it's almost like a mini project in itself in terms of having to involve the right stakeholders. You need to do a kickoff, you need to gather your requirements, build, test, and then deploy everything back into production. So when it comes to areas that you may consider looking into, utilizing if you have constantly changing working patterns, is the work patterns functionality instead of having a long list of shift rotations. So initially, some organizations may go with the option of we are creating shift rotations and applying this to all of our employees, and so that our managers will be able to schedule based on shift rotations. But you could consider an alternative to adjust to more of a working patterns functionality, as opposed to having a really long list of constantly changing shift rotations and having to amend those shift rotations for each individual employee in their employee record. This does help reduce the amount of admin time from a manager's perspective. So think about a manager that has to handle scheduling on a recurring basis. We would suggest reducing their amount of time spent on manual changes for each employees, trying to remember, oh, Will is on this particular part-time pattern. They prefer Tuesdays off, but they would like to work on Saturdays, whereas Vicky enjoys working, would prefer working on the weekends and doesn't really have availability for the weekdays, as an example. So there's constantly changing shift schedules and working patterns. You could look at a hybrid approach, not just using only shift rotations. You could consider working patterns as well. Another area I would suggest before you move on, Will, is really to look at effectively training your schedulers on how to utilize these scheduling shortcuts. So there are a lot of tips and tricks. I like to think of scheduling in Dayforce kind of like learning how to use Excel. There are so many shortcuts, so many ways you can view, toggle between different options, the shortcuts to copy and paste, create templates. I would recommend ensuring that you're training your schedulers effectively to utilize things like the scheduling templates and the favorites and toggling between the bar view or the grid view. It really enhances their efficiency in creating these very manual types of schedules.
Yeah, I think some really interesting points there. And I was almost thinking of a Rubik's Cube in my head, like trying to get folks the most the easiest way of doing it. But yeah, Excel, I suppose, works as an analogy as well. But have you seen firsthand organizations when they have handled this efficiently using some of those workarounds, I guess the amount of time and the benefit that it has to the business?
Yes, and time again, I think Dayforce has some statistics on this previously, but the amount of time that's reduced from the scheduler or the manager's perspective is cut drastically shorter when they are effectively utilizing the scheduling piece of the system. That said, there's also the timesheets component. So for WFM, you have your schedules, a bit more future looking, and then you have your timesheets area where the managers are then authorizing punches, clock in and clocked out from your employees. And there's also additional optimizations you could introduce to reduce the admin time for timesheets authorizations also. So you're now shifting the focus and time spent on all this manual admin work so that your managers can then better direct their efforts for more critical tasks. So when it's done efficiently, there's a significant reduction in the amount of time that managers are fiddling around with schedules, amending schedules that have already been published, leading to better efficiencies for other responsibilities that they may be involved with. So with our experience, we would recommend continuous regular meetings with these types of floor managers or workforce managers, making sure that you're targeting key individuals that use scheduling and timesheets features the most, capture their feedback on any continuous frustrations or challenges they may encounter, and then look at ways the system can automate these tasks through existing functionality. And we've seen a number of organizations provide their feedback and saying, this has really reduced the efforts and significant amount of time spent for our managers having to look at previous approved holiday requests, trying to fit in this big puzzle when it comes to scheduling. So there's been a lot of positive benefits that we've heard across our projects related to the WFM components.
And then by contrast, you spoke a lot there about best practice and some really great tips with workarounds. When you've been on the client side managing the platform, what's the knock-on impact if people aren't doing this and there becomes an increasing amount of manual intervention with scheduling?
Yeah, there's a few areas that we've noticed. It's aside from just the time spent by admins on manual input or extra data entry loads, there is a knock-on impact on the organization's view of a system like Dayforce and its benefits. If you're looking at from a perspective of, say, the management level, wondering why you have a system like Dayforce that can't handle simple scheduling or timesheets. So there is additional frustrations that are experienced for a number of team members beyond just HR and payroll. It really has a cascading effect on other areas of the business as well, just kind of a negative view on the system. So if some organizations need a bit more support in making sure that they are optimizing as much as they can across the Dayforce WFM module, we're always happy to help bring forward some of the experiences that we've encountered to ensure that you're streamlining your operations.
Yeah, I think there's some good points there. I've spoken to organisations where they've said, well, we started to do this little bit manually because we just felt it was easier and we hadn't quite configured it correctly in the system. And then I think those bad habits almost creep, if that's the right way of putting it. And I think one I spoke to had got to a point where they said they had something like 60 spreadsheets they were using for scheduling, and they'd gotten to the point where they had reverted back to Excel pretty much for their scheduling and then just manually importing it or back into Dayforce platform, which again, a whole array of issues with that. But I think manual intervention, time consuming, and also errors, I think is a big part of that as well. If it's not automated or configured correctly in the system, particularly if you're large or complex, all of those things that you spoke about earlier, I think it can quite quickly be a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I agree. Well, there's a few projects that I previously worked on as well, where they've started taking that manual approach, and then we started kind of reintroducing some of the system functionalities. And keep in mind that these are system functionalities. It's not customized. It's just already available for all of the current existing Dayforce clients, but they didn't realize that that was a capability of the system, or they didn't realize that the solution is offered already. They just needed a bit of a reminder or a quick tip as to where to look into to make sure that they can utilize it fully.
Yeah, I think keeping up with that, we've touched upon the other points earlier, but businesses go live with a platform and then they change, they grow, whether it's their scheduling specifically or just as a business in general, new people join the business that perhaps weren't part of that implementation. So I think continuing to reinforce some of these good habits that you spoke about and upskill your team to ensure they're using it to its best potential. Yeah, absolutely. So our penultimate point we're going to take a look at today is key employee data retention issues. So again, data, a common theme of what we're discussing today. So employee data, of course, it's not just about errors or manual intervention, but what also comes into play here is GDPR and employee legislation as well. So the knock-on effects here can be huge. Can you talk us through a bit how organizations can make this more seamless in the Dayforce platform?
Yeah, so during initial implementation, you'll quickly realized that there are a number of overlooked functionalities and areas in the system that are not fully understood, since during phase one, the focus is primarily on core, self-service, WFM, and payroll. However, in Dayforce, there is an area under system admin called the Data Management Center. And this is the area where organizations can manage personal data retention policies and how they are applied. And the system will then review records that they're identifying for purging before they're permanently removed. So it's a way to help ensure that the storage and retention of your key employment data is compliant with GDPR across various facets of the system. So the Personal Data Management Center is a standard offering, as I mentioned. Each country has a recommended retention timeline. For example, some countries dictate a 7-year retention of employee records, whereas for other recruiting candidate data, that might actually be only 2 years. So Dayforce will then take a look at all of the data that's captured, and then once it reaches that retention mark, will automatically identify certain areas that should be removed or expunged from the system. So it's a way to help organizations automate this process and ensure that they're compliant with the GDPR requirements. Some other areas where you could look at tying in some of the data management retention policies would be, there's an area under the employee properties where you can store personal data management types. This is optional use, but again, it's not really looked into during the initial implement stage, sometimes forgotten, but it is a functionality that you could indicate an employee property for this personal data management type. And then this would then be pulled into the data management center so that the system automatically identifies which parts of the employee record are due to be removed.
And have you seen organizations effectively configure this part of the platform and use it to their benefit?
From my experience, not a lot of projects that we've worked on actually go into this in detail. It's more of the guided session approach where if we have time, we would go into the specifics on setting up and amending some of these policies, what this area is affecting, maybe going through some of those general ad hoc reports that are available related to employee data retention. So to be honest, it's not something that we really look into, but similar themes for some other features across the system. There are so many other areas that you could improve or modify, but you just might not get to it during phase one. And that's where having additional support in kind of looking at the organization system as a whole and identifying areas or gaps is something that we've supported a number of organizations with.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think during an initial implementation, those core modules are always going to take priority. They take the most effort, of course, to implement in the system. But as you say, I wonder if best practice, once the dust has settled a bit and you're live with your platform, is having that review of the areas of the system that perhaps didn't get as much attention. I know there's often training and learning materials available as well that sort of show you guides, etc., how to use these. So yeah, I think it's a good one to point out. One question. We've covered data on several of the topics today. I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you for your expert opinion as well. So is there often a misconception about who is ultimately responsible for employee data in a HRIS system?
Yes, I think time and time again, this is usually brought forward in that from a requirements perspective, ensuring that anything in your HRS is compliant, whether it's to employment legislation, entitlements legislation, statutory leaves, and of course, data retention. It is the organization's responsibility to ensure that your system is compliant and that you are wiping or removing the relevant key components of the employee record based on the regional or the country legislation requirements. So it is up to the organization itself. You, audience members, are the owners of your employee data, and therefore you should manage it in a sensitive way, ensuring that it complies with the relevant GDPR regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a platform like Dayforce, of course, has a lot of functionalities to support organizations, particularly global, with their data policies. But when I was new to this industry, I used to visualize it as if the software you're buying is the house, your data's your furniture. So it's your job to get your furniture out of your old house, maybe do a few tip runs or whatever you're going to do, and then ensure it's properly put away in your new house. So if that helps anyone, that's how I used to think about data. So yeah. So on to our final point now. I would also just point as well, there is the chat function. You can ask questions. So if any do pop up, we can either cover those at the end, but feel free to pop in anything there that's may have cropped up throughout the session. So last but not least for today's session is tracking HR policies for compliance. So I think on the topic of underutilized areas of Dayforce, I think you'd probably agree, Vicky, this is another one of those. So if you could expand further on this, please.
Yes, so this may be a point that may have been covered very briefly during your initial phase one or a core implementation. But when we're speaking about HR policies for compliance, we're not referring to the employment policies and the employee settings. So we're not referring to entitlement policies, pay policies, schedule rule policies. What we're referring to here is actually capturing your company's HR policies and ensuring that your employees have had a chance to review the policies and acknowledge that they have understood the policy itself. So the HR policies area is housed under the HR admin part of the system. And as you mentioned, Will, it is underutilized in some aspects. It's sometimes skipped over as a nice to have during the initial part, but it is a useful resource and a tool for HR team members to ensure that they're now launching their, for example, updated workforce bullying and harassment policy through the Dayforce system. And as well, there's ability for the users to then download a copy of the latest policy through the system and then check off that they've understood and read it. So when it comes to version dating, Dayforce does handle system versioning related to your HR policies. Another policy that we've seen very common would be things like updating your code of conduct policies. When it's reviewed, this can be then added to your Dayforce HR policies area for your employees to then go ahead and make sure they review and acknowledge they've understood it. Another area that we have seen tied to HR policies is utilizing Dayforce learning as well. So usually when you're introducing a new policy, there is some concept or aspect of training involved. You, for example, that workplace bullying and harassment policy I brought up earlier, you may need to train your employees on what the policy is changing, the impact to them when it comes to reporting incidents and other types of obligations. So we would recommend taking a look at Dayforce Learning as well and tying that into tracking your HR policies for compliance, ensuring that you're demonstrating your employees are actually understanding the policy and have the knowledge required after going through that learning course. It's more of an immersive type of experience instead of having just a policy available for download. So we've seen it worked very well for and very successful for organizations that tie in the learning component to introducing your HR policies and tracking them.
Yeah, I really like the learning piece because I think we've probably all had it where there's a policy update, you get an email with maybe 3 paragraphs telling you this policy's changed, and then 6 months later someone says, well, remember that policy changed, and you've completely forgotten about it. So I think using another area of Dayforce to supplement that, and I think you would agree, Vicky, it doesn't need to be really complicated 50-question learning course, something quite high level and digestible, would you say?
Yes, certainly when we're thinking about the different types of learners, some learners are a little bit more visual, of course. So you may have a few videos that you'd like to just briefly put forward. Other learners are receive the message better if it's an audio version, say a podcast. So when it comes to Dayforce Learning, you can create the course content materials as you wish. Publish it to your employees, and then make sure that you're tying it with the HR policies for compliance so that it's tracked that the learners have definitely taken the course and they've acknowledged the policies, and you have an audit trail for reporting purposes.
Fantastic. So that's part one. That's our first 5 points. And we have had a couple of questions come through, which I'll get to now. And again, if anyone wants to pop anything else in the chat, let us know on the Q&A button on your screen. So We were talking about Copilot earlier, Vicky. Question we had was, does everyone have access to Copilot, and what other functionality does it have? I appreciate we said you could probably spend an hour on its own talking about this, but if you could perhaps cover that off in some detail, that would be great.
Yeah, so the Dayforce Copilot is an additional add-on. So it wouldn't be available for every current Dayforce client at the moment. It's likely you would need to engage with your client success manager or from the Dayforce side of things to activate and enable the Dayforce Copilot embedded in your system itself. So it's not available for everyone, but perhaps will you have a bit more insight in terms of how to engage with Dayforce on getting the Copilot features enabled.
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously AI is everywhere at the moment, but I know Dayforce is certainly trying to be at the forefront of that for HR tech. And Vicky, you said earlier, you've seen it in action, and there is some great functionality it has. So yeah, if you're interested in Copilot, you can reach out to ourselves for a further chat about that. But ultimately, it will be your account manager or client success manager that will be able to talk to you about Copilot if you don't have that already in your platform. But I think we should pencil that one in as a future topic. I think that would be a good one to cover. And then the last question we've got, a bit of a general one on data. So are the data retention center reminders automated? If so, who do the reminders go to? And will data be automatically deleted if no one does intervene?
So there is an area under the Data Management Center for scheduling reports for the identified users that would fall into the time frame of, say, a 7-year retention policy or the 2-year retention policy. So those notifications could be set up if you have a scheduled report. And again, just a reminder to those on this call, you may have initially set up a subscribed user for these types of scheduled reports, and that person may no longer be at your organization anymore. So you should be reviewing these types of notifications periodically, potentially as part of your governance and your security role type of program. But there does exist some capabilities where you can have some notifications related to the data retention policies. And I think the next part of that question was related to in terms of the. Sorry,
Yeah.
what was the last part of that one?
No, there was a few parts to that one, wasn't
Yeah.
there? So the last part was, will data be automatically deleted if
Yes.
no one
Sorry, thanks.
intervenes?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Will. So there are options that you can set. I mentioned the identify option. So Dayforce, you can set the configuration so that Dayforce identifies certain users or parts of the employee record and slates them to be removed. And there's a manual button, a manual input that's required from someone at your organization to actually say, yes, I agree. We've reviewed this list of employees, and these are the ones that should be removed from the system. There is another option where there's the identify and delete setup as well, which allows Dayforce to run the identification process, and then at the same time automatically remove and purge those files. So there you can decide which option you prefer. Our recommendation is the identify process, just because you do want someone to have that second set of second set of eyeballs to look at which employee records should be removed. And a cautionary tale that sometimes when you do permanently remove this information, it is fully removed from Dayforce. There is no way that you can reinstate or go backwards. So just be aware that if you are permanently removing this data after you've identified it, it is a permanent solution.
Good stuff. Thank you, Vicky. So unless there's any final questions that pop up now, I think we've covered those, which is great. So I think all left to say is thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you found some of this useful, and there's some good tips and tricks coming from Vicky, our in-house expert. So if you do have any further questions, or you want us to expand on any of the points that we've discussed today, please feel free to contact Vicky or I directly. You can also get in touch via the Silver Cloud website. Again, if you have any questions about Dayforce in general or Silver Cloud's Dayforce practice and services, get in touch. You can also go on the Silver Cloud website. On there, we have done several other Hello Helpdesk sessions. There are recordings available that you can find. The recording of this session will also be shared as well. So if you want to rewatch, if it was that interesting for you, hopefully so, or share internally with any colleagues, please do. And then finally, just a reminder that this, of course, was part 1 of 2. So Vicky and I will be covering 6 through 10 as a part 2. That is currently being penciled in for the 10th of April, but invites will be going out shortly for that. So if you found this useful, it would be great to see you there on our follow-up session as well. But yeah, Vicky, any last words or thoughts?
It's been a pleasure, Will. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on our part 2 session in April.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Good to see you.